Man Up, a program dedicated to inspiring and helping men live lives of heroic virtue. And now, it's time to man up.
Welcome to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. We are broadcasting on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. I am Joe Stopulos, and today I am joined by Dr. Gregory Robson, and we are going to discuss the virtue of justice. Let's start in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and the snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. The Father, and the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hope you're enjoying this series on the virtues. I was in the overview, and then last week we kind of dove deep into prudence. Prudence, kind of that guiding principle, the guiding virtue to the other virtues. Now, today, we're going to step into the virtue of justice, which in its most basic form is giving one their due, giving somebody what they are due. Again, this manifests itself in so many parts of our lives, whether it's at work or at home, throughout, and we'll talk about this within the spiritual life. There's so many facets to justice. And I think, especially with the word social justice being thrown around so often, the word justice, people really want to have a just society. What does that look like? I think it's way more complicated than a lot of people seem to think. I think people have lost a lot of the actual meaning of the word justice. And so excited to have on Dr. Robson today to discuss the virtue of justice. So we're going to head to a short break, and we will be right back.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio is provided by Dr. David Ball from Des Moines Eye Surgeons, your total eye care specialist specializing in cataracts and glaucoma care. Des Moines Eye Surgeons, 515-255-3546, dmisurgeons.com. Support for Iowa Catholic Radio is provided by Construction Professionals. Construction Professionals does remodeling and new construction. Construction Professionals is a Catholic family business built on a strong foundation. cpcustomhomes.com. Thank you, Construction Professionals, for supporting Iowa Catholic Radio.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio comes from Deary of Ames, home of Warranty Forever, offering new, used, and commercial vehicles as well as service and Mopar parts. Deary of Ames is located just off of Highway 30 at the Dayton Avenue exit and online at DearyAmes.com.
Iowa Catholic Radio would like to thank our business partner, Dino Storage, 2725 2nd Avenue in Des Moines, offering monthly rentals, indoor climate-controlled storage, and package delivery to your unit. Learn more at dinostorage.com.
My help comes from you. You're right here.
Welcome back to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. Excited today to have on Dr. Greg Robson. He is an assistant professor of philosophy at Iowa State University, friend of mine. Gotten to know him over the last couple of years here, and he approached me about Aristotle a few years ago when I was talking about Aristotle, and we got into some philosophical conversations around that. And as I am kind of working through the virtues here, he's been helping me out, finding guests, and now joining me to discuss the virtue of justice. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. It's great to spend this time with you and your listeners.
Hey, well, let's do this. Can you give our listeners a little background on yourself, maybe a bit on how you have come to be the guy I'm talking to the virtue of justice with, and maybe what gives you the credence to discuss this and be the expert on the subject?
Sure. So I'm a philosopher with background in economics, business, and political science. And I teach and write in the areas of moral, social, and political philosophy, including some work in business ethics and technology ethics. So I've been studying Aquinas' work for a while and Aristotle's work, and do a fair amount of teaching and writing on virtue ethics in particular.
Okay. Well, yeah, when we were talking about, which one to have you on for, you signed up for justice. And I said, I think for all the virtues, but I think maybe this one specifically, I really want to know the background of the history of how did this framework come about that justice was then seen as a virtue? Where which philosophers were the first ones to come up with this, and then how did it get refined and then into the Catholic world? How did justice become one of the four cardinal virtues that we speak of?
Great question. So maybe I'll say first a bit about what justice is, and then I can say a bit about the history afterward, if you'd like. So justice is commonly thought of as an individual and a social virtue. Okay, so it's an excellence. It's an excellence of individual human beings, and an excellent person is a just person. It's also an excellent feature of social institutions. Hence, we say things like a government is just or unjust, meaning that it's a better government if it's just and worse if it's unjust. So justice as a virtue is actually a kind of a way of thinking we employ all the time, even without knowing it. So as drivers, for example, we use our turn signals. Okay, why do we use our turn signals? Well, we do so because at least many of us think we owe it to other drivers to give them a heads up so that they can coordinate what they're doing. So we wouldn't be excellent drivers if we never used a turn signal, for example. Students, as another example, they don't cheat on exams. And when they don't cheat on exams, that's not just because they fear getting caught. Morally, it's because they think that it's the wrong thing to do. It would give them an unfair advantage over others. Also, you can think of ourselves as, husbands or wives. Husbands and wives need to give each other time as spouses. So if you give your spouse too little time, that can be a private injustice. It can be a private way of not giving your spouse their due. So really, in the social world, when we're dealing with our spouses, when we're dealing with friends, colleagues, fellow citizens, and so forth, we're constantly trying to give the right amount of time and effort and energy and so on to them. And so Thomas Aquinas, for example, whom I'll talk about a bit later, discusses this as the virtue of justice. So it's an individual virtue in that way. But justice is also a social virtue. So I'll just say briefly, you can think of justice, for example, in terms of just governments, as I've said, and you can think here of the so-called principle of subsidiarity. And this is the idea that in a just society, government will be done at the lowest level feasible. Okay, so it doesn't mean that therefore at the lowest level always, but it means that when you have regulations, for example, of public policies, they'll be done at a low level if possible, locally. So, for example, presumably we wouldn't want the federal government to determine the arrangement of traffic lights in Ames, Iowa. If Washington, D.C. policymakers were determining very local level matters that might be morally problematic, and there's, of course, a whole lot to consider there, but that's an example of the principle of subsidiarity. So justice is a virtue that really reigns in our selfishness, and it helps us socially. So it helps to promote the common good, and it helps us as individual persons to develop in the way we treat other people.
So the idea, the definition I've always heard is that you're giving someone what is their due, right? So the virtue of justice is seen in, at least especially in the individual level, how I treat people in what is due to them, right? And that could be in that manifests itself in a myriad of ways. And I'm assuming Thomas Aquinas would agree with that definition of it. I'm curious, to the extent that you agree with what I just said there, who decides what is due somebody?
Great question. So first, yes, justice is typically thought of as a matter of giving others their due. So it's an other regarding virtue. So you have the cardinal virtues of justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. And you can think of temperance, for example. So a temperate person has that virtue because of how they act themselves. So typically they avoid gluttony, for example. Okay, that's not an other regarding virtue per se. It's not one that is directly related to treatment of other people, but justice is related to treatment of other people. And as you say, Joe, it's specifically about giving others their due. Now, you asked who decides what others' due is, what's owed to other people. That's a really good question. It's partly a practical question. So for one thing, we have to decide in our own lives as husbands, wives, friends, colleagues, and so on, we have to decide or at least make a judgment about what we owe other people. And that can be, again, in terms of our time, in terms of the use of our skills or talents or what have you, our resources, our money. We have to make a judgment, and it's hard to make that judgment call in many cases. Similarly, a political community, in a way, has to make a judgment as well. So policymakers, in some cases, need to do their best, hopefully, to decide about just allocations of resources or just political rights and liberties and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting as justice flows. So, like we talked during the prudence episode, that, prudence is the overarching virtue that directs the other virtues, right? So if I have the wisdom of prudence, I then have the ability to know what is just and unjust more fully. And so then it comes down to this idea of, and I know Aquinas, if what I've been told is correct, that he wrote more on justice than any other virtue. And I don't think that's because it's the most important of them. It's obviously one of the four most important virtues, but I think it's because it shows itself in so many ways. I feel like justice can manifest itself in so many ways. I'll pass the ball back to you on this. When we're looking at our lives, where do we see, maybe first off, from Aquinas' standpoint, what was his major theme on justice? Is there something that's overarching when Aquinas talks about justice? And then how do you see it manifesting itself in our day-to-day lives?
So for Aquinas, justice is a steady and lasting disposition to give others what is their right to have. So basically, it's a disposition to give others their due. Now, one thing that's important about that is that it's part of our character. So Aquinas follows Aristotle, whom Aquinas called, in an honorific way, the philosopher, because Aristotle's philosophy came into circulation during Aquinas' lifetime in that era, when Aquinas lived from 1225 to 1274. And so Aquinas follows Aristotle, and Aristotle said, look, I'm just kind of zooming out a bit here, Joe. Aristotle said, happiness, the most fulfilling life, the best life, is a life of virtue and external goods. He meant by that, happiness is a life in which we practice virtues well, such as justice, and a life in which we have goods like, say, health and wealth, goods that are important for a life well lived, but are subject to luck. Like you can, lose your money because the market turns, there's a downturn in the market, or your health can go in a bad direction if suddenly a disease, strikes one, and so on. So Aquinas follows Aristotle, but he says, look, as far as practical living, what we're after is happiness in the sense of blessedness. So for Aquinas, he thinks that we want the beatific vision, which is being in full communion with God. We want the vision of God, and that's basically what heaven is. In short, it's being in perfect communion with God based on our own free choices, the characters we develop, including our virtues, like the virtue of justice, and then God's grace in helping us throughout our lives and afterward, according to Aquinas.
So as I'm looking at my life, I know obviously the sin of justice, the virtue of justice is related to a lot of the sins that could be committed against neighbor, against God, against others. I'll turn the ball over to you. I've got some thoughts, but I want to hear your thoughts on where is this happening most? Where would I see this virtue of justice in myself as a father, in my work environment? What would be the guiding principles of me trying to live a just life on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. One area is this really important area, I think, in our society today, which is that of, the home life and giving enough time to one's spouse, one's kids, and then afterward, one's friends, neighbors, colleagues, and so on. Another area, of course, is living out one's vocation well. So for a follower of Aquinas, it's important to live out a vocation in a way that brings one closer to God. And then there are other things as well, and just briefly, for example, being a good citizen, which might involve, say, driving and using your turn signal when you drive as a small but important thing to get along well with others.
I like how you're.
What do you think?
I was going to say, I like how you're telling me that if I use my turn signal, I'm a just man. So that's good. I feel like I'm a virtuous man because of that.
Yes, indeed.
No, some things I had, I think this is an interesting one because things that I tend to not, I think we've covered a lot. So to me, justice, right? What's a just thing would be if I borrow my neighbor's snowblower or lawnmower or something and I break it. Well, it's not just for me to just give it back to him and in a broken form, right? There's some level of expectation in humanity that says, he expected this to come back as good or better than it was when he gave it to me. And so it's unjust for me to treat his stuff that way. So that's, to me, a very standard, easy way to understand this. But I believe as you get deeper into it, things like gossip, things like, my neighbor's reputation or someone at work, if you're saying bad things about them, especially if you're saying untrue things about them, or you're just painting them in a bad light, now you're being unjust to the reputation. Again, now we're kind of taking an extra step further down this road. I think we're all it's easy to see it in the physical, if not hitting people, it's not, things like that. But I think we get down this road on how we're treating our neighbor, and it's the way we speak about them. It's the way that, everyone is due a good reputation, or at least as long as they deserve it. And so to proactively work against that is a sin against justice. Are there things that I'm missing when it comes to, I've got other thoughts on again, I'm talking first off, I think maybe not familiarly, like with spouse, I think it's a different, there's different levels of ways to treat them, but just your general neighbor, people at work. Are there other examples of how justice would come into play with kind of the everyday people you're running into?
Yeah, so I think what you said is exactly right. So there can be violations of commutative justice with one's neighbors, for example. So if you borrow something and you don't return it, that can be a violation of so-called commutative justice. Then there's also political justice, which works in a couple of directions for Aquinas. There's distributive justice, in which a political community gives individuals their due. So perhaps the poor are owed enough money to get by on, to not starve, and so forth. And if that's the case, which seems very plausible to many, then it would be the case that a political community should provide for the poor, at least if private actors aren't sufficiently providing for the poor. But then there's also a third kind of justice that Aquinas discusses called general justice. And this is justice in which members of a political society give the political community their due. So they pay taxes that they ought to pay, for example. And for Aquinas, Joe, as you say, justice is a very broad-reaching virtue. It really reaches into every sphere of social life in a way. So just to take a couple of examples, one is justice in exchange. Aquinas had a view which is now much discussed and debated, including by so-called marginalists who are economists who have a certain view on justice in exchange. But the idea is, look, if you give somebody an apple, okay, and you say, here's an apple, I know you need the apple, and in fact, I know you're really hungry and you don't have any other food. If you charge the person then $50 for the apple, that would be an unjust kind of exchange. And for Aquinas, it would be unjust because there wouldn't be an equality of things exchanged, okay? So it'd be too much money for the apple, money incommensurate with the value of the apple. And then there's also the case of giving money to the poor, for example. So Aquinas says, look, you can earn and keep money, all the money you need in order to live out your vocation well. But then after that, Aquinas says, if, say, you're a decamillionaire, there's an obligation to give money back to the community to help those who can't help themselves at the moment, who don't have enough food to eat or what have you. So those are a couple of other examples.
Yeah, and he has a lot of what I think are considered sub-virtues, right? So under the overarching virtue of justice, there are ones that, again, I think don't come to mind until you unearth the beautiful, brilliant mind of Thomas Aquinas, where he gets into things like patriotism, right? So this idea that we have something due to our country as a citizen of it. And he calls that this virtue of patriotism. And I think there's an example of, we should put our children first, right? So I love all children and I want the best for all children, but I have a special devotion to my own, and a special, God has given me a special privilege to be able to put more time and effort into my own children. It's the same kind of thing when it comes to this virtue of patriotism. What are my duties to country? What are my expectations as a citizen of this country? And that it falls under justice. Again, something I wouldn't have normally thought about. And the one I think is probably arguably one of the most important, if not the most important part of justice, is justice to God. So what is due to God? Well, in the Catholic world, we would say everything, right? So we have to give God did everything for us. He gave us everything. There's nothing we can even do to make up for what God has given to us. So we just do what we can. And that is praise, that is worship, that is giving him our best, that is giving him our first fruits. So we're an unjust person if we are not seeking the Lord, if we're not giving him what is due him. And I think that was kind of an eye opener for me that it's, again, the Catholic Church, they try to make it as simple as possible, right? So they say, go to Mass every Sunday. That's part of your duty as a Catholic. You have to do that. Well, that's actually because it's underneath this rubric of justice, because it's unjust to not give God latria, to give him the praise that is due him. And I thought that was a very eye-opening to me to see praise of God under the virtue of justice. But there it is. Thomas Aquinas is very, very clear in that.
Quite so. So in Aquinas' discussion of justice, as you mentioned earlier, there are a number of questions. He devotes the most attention to the virtue of justice. I think he has around 60 questions in the Summa Theologia, his compendium of theology. And a lot of the discussion centers on basically what's involved in giving one's life to God and really living out the kind of life that we as social and political animals, in a sense, who are created by God, who are made in the image and likeness of God, on account of our capacity to reason, which is different from the mental capacities of other animals, you might say, although we supersede them. So Aquinas says a lot about religion, and really, as you say, Joe, it's a key part of it is thinking about how best to devote one's life to God. So if we're a Catholic, it's going to Mass, it's saying the Rosary, it's praying, and it's doing all of those things wholeheartedly. And Aquinas would counsel wholeheartedly with attention to detail and not just going through the motions. So those are in fact things we owe to God, so that we can never fully repay God for what God has done for us as our Creator, Aquinas would say. But our part is to basically give God everything we can.
Yeah, and again, it's so interesting to me that comes under this this virtue of justice. So we got about a minute left. Are there things, other places that you think are important for us to highlight, or other resources you want to give for further reading for the audience?
Well, one thing I'd point to is Fred Freddoso from Notre Dame has a translation of Thomas's work, the Summa Theologiae, online. You can simply Google it, and he's translated, I think, into a very accessible form, the Summa. And there are also very short versions. Peter Kraft has a version, and others do as well. I'd like to just say thanks for having me on, Joe, and thanks to your listeners for checking out the interview. They should feel free to reach out to me at my Iowa State email address if they'd like to. And I have one final thought, if I could, and I guess I'd leave it at that. Look, maybe none of us will ever be fully just in our lifetime, so maybe we'll never reach a point of treating everyone exactly as they ought to be treated. That's no easy task. But even so, I just wanted to stress that justice is still an ideal worth striving for. So it's a virtue that orders a human life to excellence, and it's also a social virtue, that helps us to secure institutions like families, churches, clubs, the state, the marketplace, and so on, to ensure that these are working for the common good. So with that, I would just say, I think we should all try to do our part, and very often, not necessarily, but very often, that starts with ordering our own lives towards justice.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that thought. I think that's a great way to end it. Again, I think as I explore all the virtues, the more I just realize that as we study them and the more that we try to habituate them, the better that we'll all be as people. So, Greg, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
All right, stick around. We're headed to a short break, and we'll be right back.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences, where you can chart your course for more.
Mercy College provides unparalleled clinical rotations, hands-on learning, accelerated education, and flexible schedules. Since 1899, Mercy College has been transforming students into healthcare professionals. Guided by Catholic values, our faculty put classroom theory into practice. Students are prepared for roles in service and leadership throughout their own careers.
Learn more at mchs.edu. Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu.
Hi, this is Matt Wilcomb from Iowa Catholic Radio with another testimonial, this time from Whitney, who says, When I started listening to Iowa Catholic Radio, I started hearing about all of the different resources. It was amazing, and it opened up the state and the community. For Whitney and so many others, Iowa Catholic Radio is truly a lifeline. Our on-air fundraiser starts February 27th, but you don't have to wait to give. Donate now at iowacatholicradio.com. Thank you.
My help comes from you. You're right here.
My thanks again to Dr. Robson for helping us on the virtue of justice. I also need to make a plug. I have to thank him in general, as I mentioned already in that interview, but it bears repeating. This series couldn't have been done without him. I'd been procrastinating it for some time. I sometimes procrastinate. Oftentimes I'm a doer. This is one where I just knew that it was going to be a lot of work, quite honestly, because to find these guys, finding the right guy for the right thing, I wanted to make sure that each episode had someone who was dialed in on the specific virtue and was excited about it. I got that, but it was a lot with the help of Dr. Robson. So need to put a plug in for that. So this idea of justice, again, I think we oftentimes lose sight of just how deep it goes, right? So it's not just, I think people think justice, I think the laws, and I think following the laws and giving people what they were justly due, but I think there's way more to it than that. I think, again, we can see it in our families, especially with our spouses and our children. What is just, what is truly their due. I think we see it a lot, in society, at work and whatnot. But I really think the one that to me was kind of an eye-opener as I got into this world of studying this is that, what is due to God? What is due to God is this idea of latria, this idea of praise, this idea of worship. He gave us everything. And so the virtue of justice compels us to give God his due. Obviously, to give others their due, which I think we all hopefully understand. Hopefully, we'll understand it better. But also that God falls into this idea of justice as well. So thank you for joining me today on Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. I am Joe Stopulos. It's time to man up.
Man Up, inspiring men to live out their call to holiness.